Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Thoughtful Bro. We are here for another amazing episode this week with Haugh and Jordan Blayshek. They're the authors of Union. We're going to have a fantastic discussion today about ways to find common ground in our current, totally highly charged and in disarray political world. This is a book of real optimism. I'm somebody who enjoys harmony in all its forms, and the effort that these two made to be friends, to find common ground between someone who leans left and someone who leans right. It's just an amazing, entertaining book. And so stick around for the next 30, 40 minutes and we're going to dig into it. So a few things. First of all, of course, as always, we're streaming live on A Mighty Blaze. A Mighty Blaze is a collective of authors. We all got together at the beginning of COVID because so many of our friends and friends of friends and in our network had their book tours canceled. So the number one thing is that we are here to support authors who have books that are releasing. We're an all volunteer organization, and we're just trying to make connections virtually because they can't happen anymore physically. So if you want to support us, the main thing to do is just watch our videos, like them on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. You can find all of our past videos on YouTube on our A Mighty Blaze page. I mean, these are interviews with, just in the last week, we had Erica Jong, Dean Koontz, Edwidge Dandicat. We've had John Irving, Judy Bloom. It's been an amazing, amazing group of folks. So please check us out anywhere you can and just engage with us. We won't bite. We also have our Blaze the Vote initiative, which is just very briefly, I mean, we're just trying in this month leading up to the election to bring on anybody who can inform the people who watch our videos about, political issues like how and why and where to vote, and certainly the interview you're about to hear falls into that category. If you have an audience question for either Chris or Jordan, please just put it in the Facebook chat and it will find its way to me and I will ask them probably around minute 30 or 35 of this interview. Jordan's got a hard stop at 2:40, so we're going to try to cut it off then. Next week, one final thing is next week I have on the amazing Phil Clay. He's going to discuss his new novel, Missionaries. Phil was a U.S. Marine officer from 2005 to 2009. His first book was a collection of short stories called Redeployment. It won the National Book Award. He hasn't published a book since then. This is his follow-up book, and it's his first novel. Again, it's called Missionaries. So this is going to be the second week in a row we have a Marine veteran on the show, Jordan being the Marine veteran this week. So it's going to be great. But now on to this week, folks. So Haugh and Jordan Blayshek, they wrote a book called Union, a Democrat, a Republican, and a Search for Common Ground. You guys have that book? Just hold it up for us so we can see. Oh, Chris, that was deft. Jordan, all right, thank you guys. So please just make an impulse buy. Do it for them, do it for the Blaze, do it for Karma. We're gonna put a link to how to buy it on bookshop.org down in the comments. Just go ahead and buy it, you won't be disappointed. In short, it's a story of a 3-year journey across America and these two good friends who met at Yale Law School. One is a Republican, one is a Democrat. They traveled through 44 states and 20,000 miles of road in search of the political soul of America. I would love to give you a long introduction to these guys, but I sort of want to get to it, but just very, very briefly. Jordan spent 5 years in the U.S. Marine Corps. He served in Afghanistan and the Middle East. He's a graduate of Yale Law School, Stanford Graduate School of Business, and Princeton University. Chris attended UC Berkeley and Oxford University. He began as an intern speechwriting in the Obama administration, and he also graduated from Yale Law School in 2018, where he was a Yale journalism scholar. If I had time, I would run you through these blurbs. I have to say, I haven't quite ever seen a group of awesome blurbs like this. Like Bob Woodward is telling you this is an amazing book. General Jim Mattis, former presidential candidate John Kerry. I mean, the list goes on. I think the thing is, guys, that this book just really hit a nerve. I think this is the kind of conversation that is absent and that people are really craving right now at this particular moment. So I'm glad these guys are here. That is all I have for the intro. Chris and Jordan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having us.
Awesome. All right. So one of you can take this question. I kind of briefly described your book, but just I sort of thought of it as kind of a political on the road, like a Jack Kerouac on the road, but for politics. But why don't you guys just tell us what the book's about?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. Maybe Chris can add something that I missed. So we like to describe this book as a love letter to America from two friends from opposite sides of the aisle who set out in 2016 to try to understand what was pulling us apart and walked away from these road trips hopeful for America's future. And we finished this book in 2019. July 4th, 2019 was the date we shipped it to our publisher. And 1 year later, we're still hopeful despite everything that's happened. And a lot of that is driven by the people we met out on the road, the conversations we were able to have with each other, and getting to the point where we didn't agree on every issue. We still don't on most issues, but we believe that there's so much trust and deeper shared values that that is what gives us common ground. And so this book tells that story.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Chris, go ahead.
If I could quickly add, well, first of all, Mark, thank you for having us. And also shout out to Jenna and her Twitter fingers for setting us up with you. And it's so good to be here. You know, I would only add to what Jordan said and just underline hope. Hope is something that is a strange concept to be peddling in this day and age. There's so much tragedy, there's so much misunderstanding, there's so much anger, and all of that is understandable. But we found this message of hope, and we think it's still relevant today in big ways. In fact, it probably is more relevant today than it was in 2019 when we wrote it, because our definition of hope is all about activity. It's about getting out on the road. It's about rolling up your sleeves and trying to build a more perfect union. We found more hope at the darker corners of our country and the places that are sort of more broken than fixed. We found the most hope there. And so that's the kind of message we're carrying forward, you know, in the wake of the pandemic, the killing of George Floyd, everything we've seen over the last few months. Jordan and I are still hopeful, and we hope that those who read Union will also feel that.
Awesome. Great intro. So you guys met at Yale Law School. It's described very charmingly in the book about the way you guys met and at a bar. And then Jordan had a job he needed to start, and he's like, I'm driving out there. So you decided to go out there together. But you know, what I want to dig into is that, Chris, I think at one point in the book, you say that you were, or I've heard you in an interview say that you were more pessimistic at the beginning of this journey, kind of not thinking that there would be as much union maybe as you ultimately found. I want to hear what your outlook was at the beginning and why, and then maybe hear what Jordan's response is to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I considered myself a skeptic when we started. You know, at first these road trips were just a lark. You know, they were just two guys on the road, getting somewhere, having some fun along the way. But by the time it became a project where we were seeking something, I was convinced that we were going to find evidence of a great unraveling. You know, to borrow the phrase from George Packer, and an unwinding.
And when was this, by the way? When was the first excursion?
First excursion was 2016,
Okay.
but we took road trips through 2016, 2017, 2018, even in the spring of 2019. And so the whole way along the road, I was convinced that we were going to find evidence of the opioid epidemic, you know, racial and economic inequality. If you spent time reading the Atlantic, the Times, you know, the places that I admire as a reporter, it was unavoidable that you'd worry about these things. And we certainly saw those evidence of those things, but we also saw something more along the lines of what Jordan brought to this to the table here. He was far more of an optimist. And the book is more about reconciling his optimism and my pessimism than it is about Democrat, Republican, or any other sort of division that the two of us bring to the table.
Yeah, Jordan, and I think there was a piece in the book that I also really liked that said that maybe one of the reasons that you had more optimism and more hope is because you were in the Marines. You were kind of along shoulder to shoulder with people of every gender, creed, and color, and you all found ways to kind of do some of the most challenging tasks imaginable for humans to do. And I can understand why that would give you a sense of optimism. Is that a kind of fair way to describe the source of some of your optimism?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I remember getting to my first unit in the Marines, and my boss said to me, he said something like, you know, when you see these 18-year-old, 19-year-olds for the first time running into gunfire and scaling walls to go protect their buddy or to go save a civilian, an innocent, you know, Afghani who they've never met before, you can't help but fall in love with the American people, because what other country does that? Who else sends people abroad, their 18 and 19-year-old men and women, to go defend others, and then to see that heroism in action? And I think it's true. And it's contrasted with when we're stateside, these Marines get in all kinds of trouble. They're hilarious, like rabble rousers and hellions, and They do funny stuff, but then when it really matters, they come together, they do the impossible. And so that informed my sense of what we'd find out on the road, that for all of our problems, there is this unique spirit among Americans and a unique generosity. And we did. That's what we found out there, in addition to other stuff too. And we end up with a sober view at the end of the book, where our two views, the optimist and skeptic, kind of come together with this very sober understanding of who we are today.
Yeah, I mean, that just on a side note, I just want to say personally that like one of the many things that really bothers me about our current political discourse is the way that like the military is politicized, and in the sense that like, you know, Republicans are pro-military, Democrats are anti-military. It just seems so patently ridiculous. And I just sort of love the fact that the source, like the deepest source of your sense of optimism and unity in the American people comes from the military. That's just like so encouraging and inspiring, you know, to me.
I agree. And it worries me a lot that the military is getting politicized. But the thing that drew Chris and I together early on was, in the military, it doesn't matter what party you're from. We all work together. At the State Department, there's an ethos that parties, end at the border, and you can quote Republican presidents and Democrat presidents in the same speech, and that's okay, and it's actually valued. And so that really united us early on and gave us kind of a shared understanding of mission.
Awesome. Wonderful sentiment. All right. So from those rosy comments, I'm going to move into something a little bit more contentious. One of the great things about this book is the metaphor, the obvious metaphor of this book, which is you two are on a journey and you cannot escape each other. You're in a car, you cannot leave the trip, right? And it's like the same, the metaphor is we as Americans are in this together. We cannot get off this ride. We sort of have to work it out in the same way that you two had to work it out. But that doesn't mean it's not challenging. And there's a part earlier in the book where you have like a complete blowout fight that almost basically cancels your friendship and cancels the trip, and it has to do with police brutality and crime of illegal immigrants, and I just wanted to like throw that to you guys, and just could you briefly describe what was that argument and how did it ultimately get resolved?
Yeah, that was a big one, and it was one that as you said, nearly tore us apart. It happened on the road between Arizona and Mono Lake. We were headed north. A couple nights before, we had spent the evening at a Trump rally in Phoenix, Arizona, both inside the rally and then outside with the protesters. And we had both simultaneously felt this great kind of soothing power of having seen the same things. This was very early on in our journeys, and Jordan and I, knew that we stood on opposite ends of the aisle. But when we actually got down on the road and we started seeing things together, we came away with the same facts. We came away with the same sort of takeaways. And sometimes that meant that we saw things and we articulated things that didn't necessarily make me a good liberal or Jordan a good Republican or conservative. And that was really beguiling at first. And we said, wow, we can find this common ground. This common ground is out there. Of course, at the rally, there was also violence in the streets at the end of the night. And we decided, look, we got to get away from politics if we're going to find answers to, justify this friendship that had come to feel transgressive. But because of this soothing kind of feeling that we had coming out of this rally, we felt like we could say things. And so while we were driving north, we opened up a little bit and we started to use maybe looser language around what we had seen that night and maybe the policies that the president was putting forward that we could debate usually as new friends in a sort of more subtle, more quiet manner. But I think because we were feeling this, we kind of emptied our chambers, so to speak. And, the conversation spiraled out of control pretty quickly. Jordan said something. I reacted very strongly, in large part because I was feeling like a bad liberal. Like I had spent time at this Trump rally. Like I had said things to Jordan, like, you know what, there's a power in this room when this man is talking to his flock. And so I was sort of, I was ready to fight. I wanted to feel like a good liberal again. And of course, Jordan took that and I reacted emotionally, he reacted emotionally, and we were yelling at each other. And like you pointed out, I mean, it was not a measured debate. It went all over the place. It was about scoring points. It was about expressing anger. It was not about two friends seeking a greater understanding. And eventually it ended with I can't believe you believe these things coming from me. And then Jordan saying, what does that mean? And then silence. And really in that moment, both of us were angry. If we could, we would have walked away. Thankfully, we were in the middle of nowhere, Nevada. and the closest town, let alone the closest airport, was miles and miles and miles away. And so we had to sit in silence. And because, like you said, we were stuck in this car, we actually had an opportunity to heal. We went through this grieving process where you're angry and then you're thinking twice about some things you said. Maybe you're feeling good about some stuff. Maybe you're feeling terrible about others. You're listening to, you're remembering what Jordan said, and then you're kind of coming back to the table and realizing that there's a friend across the way, not just a sort of political stand-in, a two-dimensional political stand-in. And it wasn't until we actually got to Mono Lake or near Mono Lake that we said, look, and my girlfriend laughs at me for saying this as often as I do, but I said something along the lines of, I love you, man. And this means a lot to me. This friendship means a lot to me. And I'm still heated. I'm still angry, but I want to come back to the table. And Jordan said something very similar back to me. And we weren't, we hadn't healed in that moment, but we had come back together and we had started the process of getting back together. And we would have never had that if we weren't in that car.
Jordan, is that square with your recollection?
Yeah, no, Chris nailed it. I think it speaks to like two big features of our politics today. One is that we have a binary choice, and as a result, we tend to compare like the best of our side with what we hate about the other side, and we can't imagine that someone else can see that contrast and not agree with us. And yet the other side does the same. They look at the best of their party and the worst of the other. And so it's not an accurate comparison. And so we end up talking past each other because, I'll say to Chris, like, how can you agree when Nancy Pelosi does blah, 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 and he'll do the same with Donald Trump. And that's not an accurate comparison because we have these binary choices. And people always choose their side based on what they like about their side, not what they hate. And our conversation missed that. And I think the second feature is that whenever we're having debates about politics, there's always some underlying emotion beneath it, because politics is how we unpack or come to decisions on the most important things in our society. And so it carries emotion. But often when we debate or argue or type things in Twitter, we think we're being rational. We think we're just like putting forward the best argument. And we don't realize when our words are the things we say has an emotional reaction in the other person. And so it just ends up blowing up and spiraling. And I think that's what Chris and I had happen on that fight. Like there was so much emotion underneath it, but we thought we were just making points to the other person. And the journey from there was trying to figure out how can we communicate better? How can we get better at engagement so we don't end up spiraling out of control?
Absolutely. And of course, like all that entire dynamic that you're describing is only exacerbated by a factor of like 100 once you're on social media and there's not even any context or friendship and you're just like spouting off against strangers. I think like makes it such a cesspool. But like on that note, Jordan, well, another part that I liked of the book was this description of that Trump rally. And, one of the points that came up was this kind of like murkiness below the surface. Like it's not just black and white. And like I recall like you guys writing about in the book about how, you sort of like saw somebody say, I can't remember exactly what the examples were, but like say somebody who's like pro gun rights, but they like there were like other things that were unexpected about them. And the whole point was that there's just this kind of underlying complexity, and it's hard to kind of figure out whose side anybody's really on, because once you get past the immediate surface, it right away becomes complicated. And like one further thing about that is like you have this great line in the book that I love. I want to quote it. When the cameras are rolling, people change. They become more inflamed. What gave us hope is that the performances are not who we really are. And I think that too kind of comes through, from a Trump rally. The experience of a Trump rally must have driven that home, that like it is complicated below the surface, but like I don't think the media is incentivized to show or even capable of showing that complexity.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Like it's very compelling to create this like stark narrative of good versus evil, or two sides like irreconcilably opposed, battling it out. And I think what Chris and I found over and over and over again was that things were just way more complex on the ground. And anything we would have used to stereotype people, so if someone was wearing a Make America Great Again shirt, we might have had assumptions about what they believed or prejudices they might have had, and they almost always turned out to be wrong. And it was also more complex in the sense that, it was hard to identify sides. Like at the Trump rally, it was hard to place, like, are the Black Lives Matter supporters on the same page as the Antifa people who are breaking stuff? And are the elderly Trump supporters on the same page with the people who are verging on like white supremacists, or, we saw someone out of a car raise their arm in a Sieg Heil salute. And to say like, it's just two sides, I think ignores the complexity on the ground, the multiplicity of sides. And, it's so beguiling for us to like lump everyone in together and say like, well, everybody on the left thinks X, or everyone on the right must be Y. But the reality in the road taught us that things are just way more complex. People are more nuanced. They have views that are informed by a life experience that, you can't capture in slogans or, symbols.
Can I also add on the point of performance? We've really found that like one of our lessons for how to have a conversation is being really mindful of the circumstances that you're having that conversation in. Mark, that quote you read, I mean, we were blown away by how there's one language that was happening outside the floodlights that night. And that was, say, a conversation between two BLM protesters that, had gone to the rally on the outside to protest, and two rally goers who had come out, and they were having this conversation in the dark, basically. And they were talking about what Black Lives Matter means, and they're two different sides. And they ended that conversation with a handshake, and they walked away. And it felt like there was actual understanding and dialogue there. And then literally just across the street was a shouting match being filmed with like cameras with floodlights on it. And the language there was talking points, and it was back and forth, no exchange, no dialogue. And I think that's why we tried to like work that theme of performance into that chapter specifically, because, when we are performing, when there's an audience, we are trying to win. But when we're in an intimate setting, say a car, or say a dinner table, just two people, then you're far more able to sort of tap into a understanding place, a kind of starting from a position of I'm humbled by the complexity, or I have something to learn from you, and I have something that maybe you can learn from me, and maybe let's do an exchange. And that was critical for the two of us. I mean, when we were performing, things went bad. And when we were able to sort of tap into a more intimate setting, things went much, much better.
Such wisdom, so true. All right, so guys, I'm gonna in a minute, I'm gonna move into we're gonna have some fun with like a kind of lightning round section. We're just gonna like get both of your points of view on different things. But just a reminder to anybody in the audience, if you want to leave a question, just do it in the Facebook Live chat, and the question will make its way to me. But before we get to the lightning round, just one other question. Another big fight you guys had. I know I'm just like harping on the fight stuff. We'll get to the hope at the end, okay? But another fight you had was about election integrity and electoral fraud and gerrymandering. And these were, at the time that you guys were having this conversation, really, really important issues. But however important they were then, they're way more important now. I mean, I don't need to tell anybody who's listening to this how important the issue of election integrity has become for so many reasons in this election cycle. So I guess I just wanted to kind of like go back for a moment to that argument, and not have you guys like relitigate what that argument was about, but just say like, has either of your points of view changed on this? I'm just basically kind of opening the floor to kind of discuss where you're at right now with this issue, which I know is so important to both of you. Jordan, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I'll kick off. So I think in essence, what that fight boiled down to was we started off debating voter ID laws. And I was making the case that there are legitimate reasons why Republicans feel that voter ID laws are important. And it all comes down to this idea of electoral integrity. And the charge from we were with some other friends at the time, was that actually, there's no validity to that position, that voter ID laws are just meant to suppress the votes of low-income Americans. And there's evidence to show that. And the only reason Republicans support this is malicious. It's to win. And so I got very angry, saying like, well, if you think it's just malicious, there's nothing I can say to change your mind. But I still believe there are legitimate reasons. And the debate just kind of went back and forth in that way. I think what Chris and I came to afterwards was that if we got away from the parties and away from the personalities behind them and just talked about values, where we said, look, we both care about electoral integrity. Like, it's very important to us that our elections are viewed as legitimate, that they're not interfered with by outside actors or domestic actors. We can both agree. And we can also both agree that access to the voting booth is really important, that we want to expand the franchise. That's an American value. we could both agree at that level. But when we got back to the parties, we kept fighting. And so that was a real insight for us, that if we could move beyond personalities like Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, we could have very productive debates. But there was something about the personalities today that were deranging our conversations. And I think it's because of lack of trust. There's no trust that the other side is acting with good intentions. But between Chris and I, there are good intentions. And so we could have a productive debate, come to real answers about solutions. And I think if we sat down today, we could hash out like a very good compromise legislative bill with our very bad legal training. We both agree with, because everybody in America should care about this. It's crazy that in 2020, we are worried about our votes not being counted through the mail, that we don't have a secure process, that voting is still done at the state level. So there's no sense of broad security across the country. It's kind of crazy. And again, I think at a high level values perspective, there's no daylight between us.
I mean, we put a man on the moon like 50 years ago, and we can't run an election. Anyway. But Chris, anything else?
Yeah, I mean, Jordan. I think Jordan nailed it. I would just add too that I'm very worried about voter suppression. But last time I checked, Jordan isn't in the Wisconsin legislature. He's not in the South Carolinian legislature. I mean, to Jordan's point, you really have to be able to draw distinctions. And I would also say that, Common Ground is a project. Common Ground isn't all of Jordan's political philosophy or all of my political philosophy, but I care deeply about Jordan as a friend, as a thinker, as a leader. I care about learning from him. I've learned so much from Jordan. And if there's daylight on an issue and that's enough to push us apart, then what are we really doing here? We're not actually going to learn anything. And so, yeah, I think it's really critical to draw a distinction between what's going on far away from, say, a car, with the two of us having our debates, and what really matters to your life. But that doesn't mean I'm not a Democrat, or I don't care deeply about certain issues that maybe Jordan and I disagree on, even though this one is one that we can very easily identify two competing but shared values. And when you do that, it's just about finding that point on the scale where you achieve both goals. And yeah, Jordan and I have good intentions and we want to learn from one another. And that really matters. And I think that that's a kind of conversation that can live alongside, pushing really hard for the kind of America you want to see. And it can be part of it.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. All right. So I want to go into a lightning round before we get to a few audience questions that have come in. Ready? All right, Chris, we're going to start with you. And this is all, obviously the context of this is like you've been on this trip and like you were in a position to kind of know something about the other side. And you've been forced to think about your own views relative to your good friend's views. So the context of this obviously is your great kind of political friendship. But so Chris, the biggest thing that liberals misunderstand about conservatives is what?
Great question. That they're not, or at least Jordan, in my experience with conservatives on the road, they're not adverse or against progress. Jordan wants progress as much as I do. He approaches it differently. He thinks about different policies and about achieving the same goal. And he loves tradition, and there's other elements to the way he articulates himself, but he's not against progress. That is not like I own change or hope, for that matter. That's something that both sides want.
Got it. And Jordan, the biggest thing that conservatives misunderstand about liberals is what?
They don't hate America.
Oh, that's
perfect.
The spirit of the lightning round. Well done.
That's right. All right. So this is sort of a similar thing, but I mean, this is kind of reversing the question. So Jordan, I'm going to start with you. Speaking to an audience of liberals, I want you to fill in the blank. One thing you'd be pleasantly surprised to know about conservatives is?
We care about keeping people out of prisons. We care about lifting incomes for everyone. We care about fixing inequalities and providing free healthcare for everyone. We just might have different views of how to get there, and think about it in a much more kind of distributed, market-based way.
Awesome. And Chris, you're talking to a group of conservatives and you say, one thing you might be pleasantly surprised to know about liberals is?
Well, I want to say that we love America, but I will also add that we're okay with markets, that that we love tradition and history the same way. We just need to have an ongoing conversation about all these things.
Okay, got it. All right, Chris, back to you. I want you to turn a little bit of a critical eye on yourself and liberals, and what frustrates you most about the liberal movement. Where do you feel like liberals are the most stubborn and maybe where they should come to the table more?
It's a good question. Well, on a policy side, like infrastructure and issues that we all care about that we can get done tomorrow. But on a larger scale, I think the liberal movement right now needs to be more okay with heterodox thinking. I don't think we are as bad as certain people believe about, having to toe a line. But I think that is an area where we've drifted too far towards you must think this one thing and otherwise you're out.
Got it. And then Jordan, same question to you. What frustrates you most about the conservative movement? Where do you feel like you maybe could negotiate, but you're just not right now?
Well, I think at a high level, it frustrates me that Republicans don't put out a very compelling vision for what the country looks like in 10 years, and in a way that's substantially different from today. In the equivalent of like JFK saying we're going to the moon. Like, what do we want? It feels sometimes like Republicans are just trying to prevent sort of like the decline of empire or the fall of Rome. But we need to put forward a positive vision. And I think along with that, to be able to say like we really do want great cheap healthcare for everybody. We really do want all these things that Democrats comes very natural to them to say we want, but Republicans have a hard time admitting that we want that because we fear in doing so we open up the door to tons of government spending.
Yep. All right, two more of these. So, I mean, it's safe to say as context that Trumpism has very much changed the traditional definition of what conservatism is. There's a lot of areas where Trump diverges from traditional orthodox conservative thinking. And so, Jordan, I'm going to start with you. Whenever Trump leaves, whether that's a few months from now or 4 years from now, what do you think of Trumpism will remain in the conservative platform, and what will be sort of like dismissed and it's like back to normal?
It's a good question. I'm not sure what will go back to normal, honestly. I think what will remain is a focus on, if you take away a lot of the rhetoric and just get down to like the straight policies, I think a lot of Trumpism is around, how do you benefit as an American citizen? What is the government's role in providing for the privileges and immunities of American citizens? How is the government responsive to their needs? And I think that'll remain. I think both parties are really wrestling with, what does it mean to be an American citizen? And what does that mean in terms of the government providing you in terms of welfare, security, benefits, et cetera? I think that will remain. I think we're in this pendulum swing to a focus on the American citizen in a sort of nationalistic way. And I actually think that crosses parties, but that's what I think remains. I think what goes back is just a return to like decorum. At least I hope so. That would be my hope, that there's just a return to norms and decorum that we believe the office of the presidency has meant to uphold.
Yep. All right. And Chris, a slight twist on that question for you. So when Trump leaves, what do you think liberals like will have learned? What was the thing that they were overlooking that, fueled this rise of Trumpism that liberals need to adjust their platform to account for that?
That's also a really good question. I think we need a new political language about patriotism, about the ways in which liberal policies help everyone. I'm not entirely sure, though, to be perfectly frank.
No, but that actually was a good answer. I just want to say that little that you said, I think that was a great answer. All right. Okay. Last one of the lightning round. So Chris, we'll go back to you. Chris, what is an area that you are in strongest agreement with Jordan about?
Oh, man, that's tough. One that comes to mind is theory of change. Jordan helped me sort of clarify my own quite a bit on the road. And that's to say, he's a Burkean, so he believes in tradition, he believes in deliberation. My law school background, when I went to class, primed me for that. And so my sort of idea of progress now is constrained by the importance of certain elements of our tradition of government, tradition of law, tradition of decorum, and that's kind of new for me. I used to be sort of an unrestrained progressive, and while I still consider myself a progressive, I do think there's a lot to process.
Got it. And then Jordan, what are you most strongly in agreement with Chris about?
Well, I think we're strongest in agreement with each other that Chris has better hair.
Should I pop it? I can pop it.
Let it go, Chris. In terms of policy, I think the biggest area of agreement is in criminal justice reform. I think we both believe that if someone serves their time and really seeks to better themselves, that they deserve a second chance. And too often that doesn't happen in our country today. So we're in total alignment on the need for a much better criminal justice system, for more support for those who are returning to society.
Awesome. All right, so here we have a question coming in from Nancy Johnson. She's an author, and here's her question. Politics often align with my core values as a person, and that Nancy is a Black woman, and she says, and that has life or death consequences for me as a Black person in America. Is there anything politically that would be a deal breaker for your friendship because it's so central to your values? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one of the things that Chris and I learned about each other was about these deeper life experiences that were shaping why we chose our political views or the party that we were a part of. And those things are really deep and powerful. And often our biggest fights came when we didn't recognize that. And so we were arguing something that made the other person feel pained or hurt or threatened or endangered in some way. For me, I had friends who died overseas. And as a result, anything I heard that made it sound like America wasn't a good country, that there was something rotten about us, I reacted viscerally because it meant that my friend died for nothing, if that were true. And so, being able to see that in the other person, to understand where those deeper values or beliefs came from, allowed for greater understanding. It didn't mean that we're always going to agree afterwards, but we could at least deeply empathize with why someone felt the way we do, and why we might feel differently. Yeah, Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would only add that there's absolutely lines. I don't know where to draw them. However, I haven't really thought about what that line is, but I would also say that I think it's really important to keep dialogues open. And I know it's impossible for some people, and I don't blame them. I mean, it's really hard to talk about certain issues. And it's easy for, two white guys to talk about some of these issues as well. And we're well aware of that. But I think it's really important to keep lines of dialogue open because, absolutely there are these lines, but if you draw them too starkly, then there's no room for persuasion. There's no room for movement. There's no room for better understanding. And so to the question, yes, I mean, there absolutely are lines. I'll say Jordan and has never come close to whatever those lines are, at least as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, thank God for that. All right, so we have another question from Jenna Bloom, founder of the Mighty Blaze, and she says, well, since all 330 million Americans cannot sit in a car together, how practically do we resolve our current fractured political landscape?
That's really hard. I mean, well, first of all, Jenna, hello. Thank you for setting us up. I do think that the one thing that comes to mind, and the question of scale is so critical, and it's something that Jordan and I have been worried about since day one. I mean, in the book, we talk about how, even rolling down the window to hand over money to someone who's, a toll booth operator feels like it kind of broke a spell of our conversation. And so we've always been worried about how do we carry this out, and how do we have this conversation with friends and family and others, but how do we scale it? And I mean, one thing is it's the same argument around like everyone should vote, right? Like, to vote is almost irrational because one vote doesn't actually move elections, but we still do it because there's this important communal sense that if we all take personal responsibility for voting, we take a personal responsibility for being citizens, that it's going to move things forward. It's going to move the ball. And I think that's true of having these conversations with the people in your lives. I mean, it's been amazing being on the book tour for the last few months and realizing how many people have a similar story of a friend or a family member who feels entirely differently about politics from them, and how it's driven a wedge between them and how they want to find that dialogue. And so I think if everyone leans in a little bit more to that conversation, that could add up to something much, much bigger. But Jordan's the king of scale, so he might actually have a better answer than I do.
No, definitely not. I mean, I think that was a really good answer, Chris. The only thing I would add to it is I think in the coming months and years, I think we need a lot of courage. I think there's something deeply moral about finding common ground with people who are different from you, and to reach across differences and say, we might not agree, but like, let's find a way to live together. And it's going to take people with courage when they hear someone, who they're close to bashing the other side, or making arguments that are less than good faith, to be able to say, actually, I disagree, and here's why, and the other side does have validity or merit, and there is something worth, while to hear their perspective. And it's going to be hard because nobody wants to break with their tribes, but that's what's needed today, because the broader collective, the whole of our society depends on that, and so it's going to take a lot of courage.
Yeah, and I just want to say, like, for me personally, like, my whole dad's side of the family is from Louisville, Kentucky, and they are like all over Facebook all day long, and they just go to town on each other on Facebook. And I'm like sort of part of it too sometimes. It's just like an intense political debate. There's Democrats, there's Republicans, all in the same family, all in the same household. And I think like what undergirds what's so beautiful about it is the same thing that's undergirding what's so great about your trip, is that, like, for me, in my family, it is not an option to dismiss somebody from your own family. It is not an option to get out of this family. I love these people. Everybody in that family loves me and loves each other. And there's just sort of like, well, what are you going to do? Like, leave the family? Like, no, you just keep going, And I think that I always am so grateful. I live in Massachusetts now, which is like, definitely one of the most liberal states in the country, but it's like the conversation can be one-sided in Massachusetts, but I always love that I have my family in Kentucky that just sort of grounds me and makes me realize that, like, there's always two sides to this. So I just like that whole atmosphere. All right, guys. Hey, last question. This is sort of a question in the audience, but it's like the same as like the final question that I wanted to ask you guys. The question from the audience was about what makes you most hopeful right now in this landscape. And I also wanted to give you guys an opportunity to just tell, like, on your trip, like, what was maybe the most hopeful moment, the most hopeful thing that you witnessed. But you can kind of answer it either way, just giving an opportunity for both of you to end on a note of hope. Jordan, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I'll start. I feel like Chris and I could probably predict what each other will say, but I think for us, we spent some time in Detroit and Tulsa, both cities that have had really troubled pasts. And in Detroit, we spent some time with a group of men in Parnell Prison who were part of a Shakespeare in Prison ensemble, which just sort of on its face, like, is so surprising and amazing that we were really struck by this. And we were able to go inside and watch them act out a scene from King Lear and then stay for discussion. And these men had the most thoughtful discussion I've ever heard. It surpassed anything Chris and I had experienced at Yale or any of our other schools. And the men were so driven to make themselves better in the worst of situations, and they knew the odds against them. And yet they believed so deeply in redemption and the power of redemption, that it was hard to walk away from them and not just be deeply hopeful that if these men could express that amount of hope and determination, that the rest of the country can too. And that gave me a lot of hope about the possibility for renewal, which is certainly what we need right now.
Yeah. And I could tell a dozen more stories along those lines, whether it's the women from Bags to Butterflies just down the road who had spent a collective nearly 80 years in prison and still came out the other side and said, we're going to make something of this, or Tulsa, where if you've seen Watchmen or you've been reading the news recently, you know about the race massacre of 1921 and this really difficult story and history of the city. And yet there's all these people from every corner of that city that are fighting so hard for a future. The story of hope is the small fraction of the story of hope is Jordan and mine. The bigger fraction of it is the people who told us this story of hope. I mean, this book is memoir and it's reportage, and the hope comes from the reporting. It comes from these people who have seen the worst of this country and still believe in this country. And that was super powerful for Jordan and I, and it was powerful in 2019, and we hope it's even more powerful in 2020.
Awesome. Great note to end on. Guys, just hold up the book one last time so people see it. It's a fantastic book. It's a great read. And and the message is just outstanding. So when you're feeling low and down and kind of disgusted with everything that's going on, pick up Union and you're going to feel better about the United States. So Chris, Jordan, thank you guys so much for coming.
Mark, thank you. This was wonderful. Thanks a lot.
Amen.
Awesome, guys. Cool. All right. Well, guys, next week we'll be on with Phil Clay, the National Book Award winner, with his first ever novel. It's going to be terrific. I've heard he's great at live readings, and so we're going to tap into that. Chris has heard him read before, and apparently it's amazing. So tune in next Tuesday at 2. We'll see you all then. Thanks for joining.